Hello and welcome to Inside the Vault. My name is Sandy Trenholm and I'm the collection director for the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. And tonight we're going to be discussing baseball during World War II with Dr. Michael Neiberg. It comes from the collection of Lieutenant Robert Stone, and it's one of more than 500 items that were donated by his wife, Sheila. In September of 1944, Bob was writing from Oahu, and he was stationed there to be trained as a bombardier in the 431st Bomb Squadron in the 7th United States Army Air Force. And so while he was there training, he had the opportunity to go and see this baseball game. Since he is in the Army, he was probably a little sad that Navy won. But when we got this document, it was really interesting. When people look at soldiers' collections, Mike, this is my experience, but when people come to us and ask to see soldiers' collections, they expect it to be all about war all the time. And it's not. It's about a lot of other stuff. Home life, food is a huge topic. And then like all these things that encompass like camp life. And so this is one of the neat ephemeral pieces that came that I think show what other activities people are doing. And it made me wonder what's going on, like what was the role of baseball during World War II in sports? So then we turn to Mike, who is absolutely amazing historian, and I absolutely love working with you. Mike and I just completed a World War II exhibition, Voices of Service. So it's a fantastic exhibition. We have already 225 requests for it. So it's a smashing hit right out of the gate. And I'm happy to be working with you again tonight. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to you, Mike. Like, I know that this is a little different from our normal conversation, so I'm very excited.
Yeah, it should be fun. If you can go back a slide, I just want to make the point, since I work for the Army War College, look how many more players the Navy had than the Army had. So I think they won that by just overwhelming the Army with lots and lots of players. But we'll leave that aside for now.
Well, and I think like you mentioned Pittsburgh, and there's a Pittsburgh player right down here. So
there is a Pirates picture there. And if you look at that, you'll see some very famous baseball players. Pee Wee Reese is playing on the Navy team, Joe DiMaggio on the Army team. So this isn't like they just grabbed 15 guys in uniform and said, go get a glove and get out there and play. This is a serious baseball team. If you look at the number of people who played Major League Baseball that are on there. So that's great. The other thing the Navy did before we move on, the Navy did have a program that allowed athletes to join the Navy. They were still in the Navy, but they were allowed to take a certain number of days or hours. I'm not sure how they divided it up. And they were allowed to go into a physical fitness regimen while they were in the Navy that was over and above what was required of Navy people. And the idea was this would keep them in shape so that when they went back to their civilian baseball teams or their civilian athletic teams, they would go back in tip-top physical condition. So the Navy did have a sort of I don't know what you want to call it, a little bit of an edge there. And this continues in a little way. The service academies have something similar for athletes that they think have a chance to go pro. They can delay their military commitment in order to pursue a professional program. So we're not totally over with this yet. But thanks, Sandra, so much. And what we decided we would do is talk a little bit about the historical background of all of this, because of course nothing ever happens in a vacuum, and this incident that we're talking about today doesn't either. Yeah, can we stay on? Oh, it doesn't matter. We can stay on either one if you want. A couple of these images that you'll see here, most of them come from the GLI collection, but a couple come from my home institution, the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center. Every image that I'm going to show you here that says Army Heritage and Education Center, they are public domain, which means you can Google them at the Army Heritage Education Center site. That's all I did, was go into the AHEC site and literally just search for baseball images up to, I think, 1947 or something I did. And they're all downloadable as, I think they're as PDFs right now. And you can use them. You can do whatever you want with any document that's in the Army Heritage and Education collection. They are fully public domain. I was just at Gettysburg yesterday, and it was a reminder on day one of the Battle of Gettysburg when Union General Joshua Reynolds is killed. The man who replaces him as the senior ranking officer on the field at Gettysburg is General Abner Doubleday, and there is a statue to Doubleday on the Gettysburg battlefield, and his gravesite in Arlington has a baseball on top of it. Doubleday is the guy that did not invent baseball, but during the Civil War, he helped to get what are called the New York rules of the game, which are basically the rules that we play under today, as opposed to the Boston or New England version of the game, which was a little bit more like cricket, where the ball could go. There really was no foul territory. Almost everything was in play. So Doubleday is kind of regarded as the father of baseball, if you will. And the importance of baseball to the military and to the Army specifically goes back to the Civil War and all the way through even to today, where I teach at the Army War College. My students are lieutenant colonels and colonels, but they've already begun to play an intramural softball league with each other. And the belief is that sport, baseball especially, brought with it obviously physical fitness. It was good for morale, and it was good for team building. It was good for bringing people together to work towards a common goal. And you can also follow the history of, for better lack of a better word, you can follow the history of American imperialism by tracking where baseball is played even today. So places like the Dominican Republic, Eastern Mexico, and the Yucatan Peninsula, all the way down to Venezuela until very recently. These are places, Puerto Rico, of course, these are places where the United States military had a large presence. And as a result, baseball kind of came with the United States military. And this is also true of the American South during the years of the occupation in the postbellum period after the Civil War, where you can see this, that baseball is kind of going with the American military and going with the Army. So there's a very close connection even from there. And this picture obviously is President Roosevelt tossing out the first ball in April of 1935. Roosevelt was a very big baseball fan, and that will come into play here in just a bit and will be quite important. Sandy, can we go to the second image? Is this the Philippines one? Yeah, I just love this image, and obviously it's not World War II, but I just loved it because it shows just how deep. The caption says 1942 to 45, but my guess is it's probably a bit earlier. And it just shows how deep the connection is. And they're playing baseball in front of a church, which kind of makes its own sort of statement. And the deep connections between the Army and baseball and American culture and the ways that all of these things kind of link together. And what that meant for the major leagues in the Second World War period, some of that connection had been broken by the First World War, where there were allegations that certain teams had used political influence, certain players had used political influence to avoid military service or to get exemptions from the draft when other people were going into military service. So when the Second World War came about, Major League Baseball had a very hard-nosed, very tough commissioner who came in during the Black Sox scandal of 1919, a guy named Kennesaw Mountain Landis. And Landis was adamant that baseball in World War II was not going to go through the same scandal that it went through in World War I. So Landis did two things. The first thing that he did is he told the players, we, Major League Baseball, will not support any exemption for you from military service. And the second thing is he told the teams, I will punish you. There will be sanctions if you try to get some sort of exemption. So there was a clear message from him early on, and it certainly appears to be the case, and I'll talk about some of them in a bit, that the Major League Baseball players themselves had very little interest in avoiding military service. And I'll go through some of the big names, and you saw some of them on the program that Sandy started with. So these guys are not only going into the military, as I'll talk about, some of them are going into quite dangerous jobs. These are not guys who went and took the cushiest job they could find somewhere. These were people who volunteered for combat. And as I'll talk about, some of them were in quite dangerous areas indeed. So for Major League Baseball, it's a kind of two-tiered thing, and we'll talk about it. But they sought from Franklin Roosevelt a letter that later became known as the Green Light Letter, which allowed Major League Baseball to continue during the Second World War. It also allowed for them to do something that was a little bit controversial and a little bit unusual, which was to start playing night baseball games, to use up that energy to eliminate baseball fields. And for those of you who might be Chicago Cubs fans out there, the reason Wrigley Field never did this is it donated the light standards that they were going to use to the Navy at the Navy Pier that's out there in Chicago. So it's a kind of good news, bad news situation. Baseball is going to make an awful lot of money during World War II. They are going to be able to continue. The players are going to be able to demonstrate their patriotism and volunteer for military service. At the same time, as we'll talk about, baseball did not take the opportunity to use the Second World War as an opportunity to do maybe some of the things they should have done. They definitely should have done, like integrating the game, like pushing for a greater equality in baseball that won't come until after the Second World War. The first baseball player, the first big name baseball player to volunteer is Hank Greenberg, who was a big slugger for the Detroit Tigers, Jewish. So maybe it's not terribly surprising that he was one of the early volunteers. But there are a lot of other big names, and if you're baseball fans, you'll know them. Bob Feller, Yogi Berra, who was at Normandy in 1944, Ted Williams, of course, who flew for the Marine Corps, Stan Musial, Warren Spahn, who fought at the Battle of the Bulge, Pee Wee Reese, Phil Rizzuto, Ralph Kiner, who played for the Pittsburgh Pirates. Let me get that in. And many people that were in charge of the Army, many senior leaders in the U.S. Army, were also big fans of baseball. Eisenhower and MacArthur had both been on the West Point baseball team, so it was something that was important to them to keep going. And we know of at least 2 Major League Baseball players and 2 Negro League Baseball players who were killed in action in World War II. And as I said, baseball did not lead to segregation. The owners simply had no incentive to do it. In fact, they believed that they had 2 negative incentives, 2 reasons not to do it. One of which was they were afraid that if African Americans started playing, then white fans would stay away. And they were also afraid that if the Negro Leagues went away, they would lose the rents that the Negro League teams paid to Major League stadiums to play their games. So this is an opportunity. And again, looking back, it's easy to see a very missed opportunity where the Roosevelt administration could have gone to Major League Baseball and said, we'll give you the green light approval, but you have to stop the segregation of Major League Baseball. Obviously, they didn't do that. Although Roosevelt did issue an executive order that prohibited racial discrimination in industrial workplaces during World War II. So it's not completely out of the realm of the possible that he might have done something similar, but of course, he did not. Just a couple more points I'd like to make before we get into some of these fantastic images. Many of you will know, of course, that Jackie Robinson, who was the first African-American in the modern era to play in Major League Baseball. In part, Branch Rickey of the Brooklyn Dodgers was willing to take the chance on Robinson because he knew that Robinson had had this stellar career in the military. He also knew of the discrimination and the segregation and the terrible things that Robinson had faced in the military and had respected the way that Robinson had handled those problems. Jackie Robinson at one point refused to sit in a segregated part of a military base. He was punished for it, almost court-martialed. Eventually, that proceedings was dropped, and Rickey came to deeply respect the way that Robinson had played, had handled that. We'll talk about the Women's League in World War II as well that is begun. It's not really begun to replace the Major League game because the Major League game really didn't go away. It's really there to provide a slightly more wholesome baseball type approach for people that weren't comfortable bringing their children or even their wives to baseball games. Baseball games today are not that rowdy of an affair, but get into a pennant race with the Giants and Dodgers or the Yankees and Red Sox, as we all know, it can get a little wild. The last thing that I wanted to point out is what happens at the end of the war. If teams did not pull strings to protect their players when the war began, they did pull a lot of strings to try to get their guys demobilized and back with their teams as quickly as possible. As you all know, the World War II ends. It really begins to wind down. May of 1945 is the end of the European theater when the baseball season is beginning. July, early August, it ends in the Pacific theater, which is right about pennant race time. So that's when Major League Baseball is trying to pull strings to get their guys back. And there was a interesting side note that I just want to end with. The GI Bill of Rights, of course, guaranteed any soldier could get his job back when he returned back to the United States. Well, Major League Baseball players and minor league baseball players found out that they were coming back to a situation in which they had lost their spot on the team to somebody that had taken it while they were serving, or somebody younger, somebody better, or maybe it was a baseball player that had been injured but not badly injured during their military service. Maybe they had a bad ankle now or a bad back or something like that. These players argued that by virtue of the GI Bill of Rights, they should get their jobs back. Major League Baseball disagreed. There was a lawsuit, and a Seattle Rainiers pitcher named Al Niemich sued organized baseball, and won his case. And the judge determined that he was indeed entitled to compensation, though he was not entitled to get his spot on the team back. He was entitled to financial compensation. So that's an interesting application of the GI Bill of Rights and the way that went. So yeah, so it's a little bit of a mixed bag. Baseball certainly continued to make a lot of money during World War II. It continued to profit. It continued to use special exemptions. It continued to use all kinds of things to guarantee that the teams made record profits at the end of the Great Depression, at a time, of course, when there were American workers who had free time now and disposable income and really wanted to go to baseball games. So the leagues did very, very well. The players did exemplary military service in almost all cases, and yeah, set us up for some of the debates and controversies that we would see in the post-war years, especially, of course, the integration of baseball that began with Jackie Robinson. So it's a fascinating story. Some of these guys, like I said, that go on to really famous baseball careers. Yogi Berra, the one that I always think of, because Berra was there, I think, day 2 of D-Day. I think he landed in France on June 7th as part of a Navy detachment. And Ted Williams, those of you who are Boston fans especially will know, just an unbelievably distinguished military career in both the World War II and in the Korean War as well. Yeah, I don't have a lot of information about this picture. This was also from the Army collection, but obviously sometime in the 19th century, you can see these guys. I love the manager in the back row left there with the gigantic top hat there and whatever he's carrying in his left hand. But yeah, again, just clearly showing how deep this connection goes between baseball and military service.
Yeah, I'm gonna point out, like, just looking at the photograph, I feel like it's definitely 1860s. It looks like an albumin print, and I've seen like this type of mat before. So it feels like it's
Yeah.
like either Civil War era or just after. But it's really fascinating.
Yeah, it does have that 1860s, 1870s vibe to it, doesn't it? I mean, and I love the mustache that some of these guys have, especially the player in the white uniform in the second row back there. Yeah, and there's a guy there on the right who's still wearing a Civil War field cap, so that's an indication that it could be 1870s, 1860s,
Yeah.
1870s. But yeah, fascinating picture. This is one from the National Archives. Obviously, if you're a Yankees fan, you know who the guy on the left is. If you're a New York or a Dodgers fan, you know who the other baseball player is there. My dad's favorite player when he was a kid, Pee Wee Reese, one of my dad's favorite players as a kid. And of course, the great Joe DiMaggio, whose brother Dom also served and also played in Major League Baseball. I believe played for the Pirates for a little while. And this is another one of those. DiMaggio is wearing a 7th Army Air Force. That's what AAF stands for there. So he's playing for an Air Force team at this point, and the general standing or officer standing next to him, that's a Navy uniform. I take that back. That's Navy. It looks like he's even wearing stars on his collar there. And Pee Wee Reese is obviously in a Army uniform, some sort of Army unit, and there's an Army Air Corps general standing next to him, and you can see all the GIs behind the chicken wire there, and the number of games that they played to raise soldier morale or to raise money for charities later on in the Second World War. But this one's clearly a game for soldiers' morale. Keep the troops busy and keep them happy. And Joe's signing, they're both signing baseballs here.
They're probably signing them for the generals.
Yeah, I was also looking at the general's pants, which are not well ironed. That's so that tells me they're somewhere nice, soft, and cushy, because whoever would have been around him would have been correcting that. And the necktie between the 3rd and 4th buttons there is a classic U.S. Army thing from the World War II era as well. There's Yogi, one of the most famous baseball players of his age. In this case, this is after the war, using his baseball experience and using his fame to try to sell U.S. savings bonds. This would be 1951, so the Korean War has started. Again, this is a period where Ted Williams went back into military service. It's also in this time period that Willie Mays won the Rookie of the Year award and then was drafted the following year in a thing that is a little bit hard to imagine now. And you can think of Elvis Presley having been drafted as well. A time when military service did not that fame, like Elvis or Ted Williams, did not necessarily exclude you from military service. And yeah, it's something we can talk about in Q&A if anybody's interested in it. But the way that our understandings of military service have clearly changed over time. But this is the great Yogi Berra.
And would people at that time have known that he was at Normandy? Was that kind of public knowledge or no?
I think it would have been, except to the extent that I don't know your experience with dealing with World War II veterans, but my sense of World War II vets in that generation is the attitude that many of them that I met had, that everybody was doing dangerous things and everybody was sacrificing. So I don't want to call attention to my own sacrifice. And I'm doing some research now on these people that went to Marseille in 1940 and rescued 2,000 people, and they just didn't call attention to themselves. Everybody was in danger. I wasn't in any particular danger. So I don't think the Yogi Berra sort of walked around saying, "Hey, I was at Normandy," but he was enough of a public figure and enough of a famous person, and in New York, by the way, that it would have been something that would have been clearly known about him.
Yeah, and I know with Bob Stone, the person whose collection started this whole thing, we have the letters that he wrote home about his service, which were very low key. And in oral
Yeah.
history that he did after 2000, he described some pretty harrowing events. So what they were willing to discuss at the time or right after is probably pretty different than what they would be willing to open up about later on, too.
I think that's exactly right. And the same thing is true of First World War veterans, for what it's worth, that they don't want to call attention to their suffering or what they went through, because they all knew somebody that had been killed, and that person's sacrifice was, of course, greater than one's own. But then later in life, you want to make sure that these stories don't get forgotten, and you want to make sure that somebody remembers what you had done. So, yeah, I think you're right. It's not at all uncommon in the years after the war. This happens in the U.S. Civil War as well. Gerald Linderman has written about this, where veterans kind of just don't talk about it for a very long time. And then as they start to get older, they say, well, wait a minute, I want to make sure that people know what I was a part of. And the number of people that I've talked to who will come up to me and say something like, we never knew my father or grandfather was at Normandy until he died and we cleaned out the attic, or, we never knew that he was in the Leyte Gulf battles, or whatever it was. People who they might say, yes, I served, but they just didn't want to draw too much attention to themselves. And yeah, it's kind of a fascinating aspect of this. And here he is clearly demonstrating a connection to the military, but I'm sorry, connection to the nation. But really, there's no overt connection to the military in this image. Just the fact that it is a savings bond. But he's not wearing an Army or Navy cap, or there's no symbolism anywhere in this that would indicate in any way he was a World War II veteran. So it's not like he's got the beaches of Normandy superimposed behind him or something like that. So yeah, it's just another example of how you're certainly not ashamed of it, but you don't want to call too much attention to yourself either.
Yep.
Yeah, I love, 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 love this image. So those of you that might know somebody who graduated from one of the service academies, or go, it's a very typical thing, is that when someone in the military gets married, his buddies will form this bridge is not the word I want. They'll form this kind of canopy, I guess, out of their sabers. And in this case, they're doing it with baseball bats. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of other information about who this guy was, but he was either a baseball player or a big baseball fan. And I really love this. These are Air Force uniforms. You can tell that there's an 8th Air Force patch on the left shoulder of the guy on the right. And you can also see by the hat, and my Army friends would say the slightly unmilitary bearing of some of these guys. That's a shot at the Air Force from my Army friends, on behalf of my Army friends. But I just love that image. It's also the case, I think I'm right about this, if you had taken a picture or done something like this in today's day and age, the faces, of course, of the officers would be far more diverse than they are in the 1940s, which is a reminder, too, of the great irony of both American world wars, where we fight a war for democracy with a deeply segregated army. So, but that downside, of course, on the one hand. On the other hand, it's just a great, great picture of a baseball fan getting married. Yeah, I like this one. We went back and forth a little bit trying to figure out exactly what was going on here. What I think it is a sergeant here. There's obviously a baseball game being played somewhere that is of great importance to whoever is listening. He's got a telephone line hooked up, probably to a military armed forces radio or some such hookup to a very important baseball game. And he's there changing the score behind him and keeping people updated as to what's going on in the game, which is just great. And I remember when I was doing research for my book on Potsdam, I went and found Truman was such a new president, and they were trying to brief him on the voyage over to Europe, the 1-week voyage. They were trying to brief him on all the things that a president needed to know to go meet with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. So they produced these big, thick leather books on all the important things. And then they gave him daily news updates. And the daily news updates, which are in the Truman Library in near Kansas City, they began with the day's baseball scores. So the very first thing the president saw when he woke up were baseball scores, which gives you just a sense of how incredibly important baseball was to American culture at that point. And it was, of course, the Navy who was doing all of this for him. So there might have been a military connection as well. And unlike today, when Truman was going in the summer of 45, I did note and trace that the Pirates were on a winning streak at that. That tells you how long ago it was. So it looks like the score here is something like 2-0 in the second inning with 2 outs and 1 ball and 2 strikes. And yeah, there's great stories about Ronald Reagan and Harry Carey and some other announcers. During World War II, they were not allowed to broadcast over the radio what weather was like in any American city. So if they were broadcasting a game and it was a rain delay, they would have to somehow delay and not reveal that the game was being delayed because of rain. So a batter would foul off 50 pitches and whatever else they had to do. And everybody would sort of know that something was up, but they could not say that there was rain. So this might be a legacy of that when big important baseball games were broadcast over local radio and sometimes beamed out through Armed Forces Network, which, by the way, still exists and will broadcast college football games and other sporting events to troops that are deployed overseas. Yeah, this one was great. How do you lose to Australia? Like, how do you lose to Australia? How does that happen? But apparently, this American baseball team lost 2 games out of 3 to the Australians. Like, I don't get that. If you go to Paris today, the one baseball stadium in all of France is a place called the Stade Jean Pershing, not too surprisingly, and it was built for something called the Inter-Allied Games in 1919, where they had all of these soldiers still in Europe because the peace treaty hadn't been signed yet. And one of the things they arranged was an inter-allied baseball league. So you could go there and see that this field. I think they used it for some of the Olympic softball practices, if I'm not mistaken, for teams to practice and warm up. But this is an example of trying to export the game to other cultures, which did not work particularly well. There was a little bit of an enthusiasm for baseball in Italy, a big enthusiasm, of course, for Japan. First in the 1930s, then there was very little, of course, during the war when it was seen as an American import. And then after the war, baseball became very, very big, as it did in Korea and as it did in Taiwan, all places where the American military had a large presence. Australia, it had a little bit of a run for a little while. And my Finnish friends, I was telling them that I was doing this talk, and they told me there was a little bit of a fad for a very baseball-like game played on a much smaller field in Finland, of all places. So attempts to get this game a little bit more international have been something that the Americans have been trying to do following the National Football League success in Europe. And my wife and I, they play a series now every year in London. And my wife and I happened to be there, not by design, but by coincidence, when they had turned Trafalgar Square in London into a giant kind of get-to-know American baseball thing, complete with hot dogs, which my British friends were sort of appalled by. But yeah, there it is. We lost 2 out of 3 to Australia. Now, the Australians are great athletes and they're great sportsmen, but usually they play games that involve an awful lot of contact. So I'm a little curious as to how they play this game without hitting somebody. If you've ever seen Australian rules football, you'll know what an unbelievably violent game that is. But NSW there means New South Wales. It's the state that Sydney is in Australia. So that must be what that means. And this is the Navy Army All-Star game that I think that the program is referring to, right? Or is it a different date? It must be a different date.
Yeah, it's a different date. Our date was September.
Yeah. Okay, so it's being played shortly after. This is Dom DiMaggio, Joe's brother, being played here. SWPA means Southwest Pacific Area, so it must be Pacific Theater unless they were using that acronym for something else. But you can see it somewhere with the palm trees. Certainly an indication that it's Hawaii or someplace in the Pacific where this game is being played. And this is a little bit later in the war, and it almost looks like they've got more dedicated uniforms and better equipment. So maybe they were starting to make these leagues a little bit more serious. I guess if Dom DiMaggio is playing, you don't want to go cheap on the baseballs and the bats and everything else.
I know
Yeah, but
in our
another.
flyer, Dom was playing on one team and Joe was playing on the other. So they were actually playing each other in that series, which is kind of funny.
Yeah, not an unusual thing for baseball to do, to try to get a little bit of a brother rivalry or something like that going as well. But yeah, Dom DiMaggio was a great baseball player. If he didn't have a brother named Joe, he probably would have been better known as a baseball player. But he had the misfortune of having a brother for a baseball player who was a fabulous baseball player. Yeah, this is another fun one. These is somehow the Army All-Star team. And I don't know, this image just kind of caught me. I like the sort of confident look in these guys' faces here, especially the sunglass guy there in the first row. They just look ready to go. They look ready to take on the Yankees if they have to. And but again, you can look at the image and realize pretty quickly this is a segregated army. This is a we don't know exactly who these guys are, but clearly all six of them are coming from white backgrounds. And um, yeah, the other thing that's striking to me about this image is the Signal Corps logo in the bottom, which means that this picture was being taken specifically for publicity purposes. It also means that we have a copy of it because the Army Heritage and Education Center keeps a copy of most of the photographs surviving from the Signal Corps era from both World War I and World War II. So we have an enormous photographic archive here, and it's partly because of that. So that's an indication to me that there was a publicity reason to take this picture and to broadcast it.
And just a little archival note, just in case people are wondering, the reason why you're seeing these numbers on the bottom is they're probably the negative numbers. So these are either the photographic negatives or they're contact prints made from them, because this absolutely is the edge of the photo here. The negative is right around the edge. So in case you were wondering what all
Yeah,
those numbers were that you're seeing on these images.
and correct me if I'm wrong, Sandra, they would often do this from context specifically to provide a little bit of space where they could write some sort of serial number or code number so that they could identify who
Yeah,
exactly these six guys were or where it was taken or whatever. And
right.
it's a little bit disappointing that in our card catalogs, our electronic catalogs, we don't have a lot of information. So I don't know if there's maybe there was at one point a sort of guide that would, okay, go to WPA 45 35729. It'll tell you who these guys were and whatever. Um, but we don't have a lot of what we today call metadata on these photographs.
And what I'll say is, like, if this one was taken in 1945, that's probably what this number here is. It's probably the year. So it's probably a
Yeah,
little year and then a little bit more information. Somebody has it somewhere. So go visit archives.
and WPA, that may just be an abbreviation of the SWPA, the Southwest Pacific area.
Mhm.
That may be, that may mean that's kind of the theater, or that's the command. So Southwest Pacific area was basically everything that reported to Douglas MacArthur out in the Pacific was. So that would indicate that was his command. So it at least give you an idea of what part of the world they were in, but not much beyond that. And October 45, of course, means that by this point the war is over. So even though the U.S. is doing occupation duty and some other things that they're doing, you can imagine commanders wanting to have their guys playing some baseball to, keep them busy and keep them occupied and wholesome. How do I want to put this? Pastimes that would not get the army in wider trouble. I'll leave it that. How's
Yeah,
that?
sounds great.
Was that euphemistic enough? Yeah, great.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, Fort Randolph, Texas. So these guys, I think, are certainly Air Force guys too. You can see that from the officer that's there on the bottom left-hand corner. He could not look more Army Air Force. He's got the brown shoes. He's got the whole bit there. And yeah, I this one I thought was pretty cool too. It's taken. It looks like it's taken during World War II. It's Fort Randolph, which is in Texas. And again, all white players, and but you can see the specialized gloves. You can see the guy in the back that's got a catcher's mitt there. And look how young these guys look, which is also a function of the kind of late World War II period as well. So, especially the guy that's got that catcher's mitt there looks pretty young, and the guy next to him as well. Um, but yeah, give you an idea of just again how important baseball was and is to these units that are out in places like Randolph and Randolph Fort, Randolph Air Force Base, I believe, still exists out by San Antonio. So, yeah, yeah, and again, just an absolutely beautiful 1942 Negro Leagues World Series. Two of the best players ever to play, Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson. And it's just, again, an indication of the continuing segregation that existed, of course, not just in baseball, but existed throughout the American society. And, you know, we can talk about this a bit more in the Q&A if anybody wants, but to me, it cannot be a coincidence that two of the first major institutions in the United States that do desegregate are baseball and the military. Baseball because of Branch Rickey's courageous decision to sign Jackie Robinson. And in doing that, as I think I mentioned, Rickey specifically mentioned Jackie Robinson's military service as a justification, that after World War II and after what Jackie Robinson had did in military service, there was no justification for any further discrimination along the lines of race. And, you know, I don't know how much stock I would put into it, but the argument has been put out there that one of the reasons why these two institutions desegregate so quickly, because they are competitive, and I shouldn't say so quickly, it took decades, but the reasons why they are two of the first to desegregate after World War II is that they are competitive institutions that need the best talent. They need the very best people. And that if you're going to fight a Cold War against the Soviets, or you're going to be competitive in a sports environment, you need the best people, and race can't play a factor in these organizations as much as they can in some other civilian institutions. So I'm not sure how much I buy that argument, but I think it's got to be playing in there somehow. And I do think that you have to give the United States military some credit. Resistance though there was, and horrible racists though there were at senior levels in all of the services, they adapted relatively quickly to the new reality, especially once the Korean War began. And I can talk about that a little more if anybody is interested. But yeah, it's two institutions that desegregate really quickly after the end of the Second World War. One because of business reasons, the other because of President Truman's executive order banning further segregation in the U.S. military. And I can talk more about that if anybody's interested. I know we're running a little bit short. We got to get to Q&A, but we have a couple more cool ones, don't we, Sandra?
Yep, and there's just like 3 more slides. I would say that we went and did a pretty deep dive into baseball photographs for the military in World War II, and we couldn't find any Negro military teams at the time. Like there just weren't any like official Black players for the Army and the Navy that we could find pictures of. So if anybody has,
so I can't I can't say for sure why I think that is, but I have a guess. And the guess would be that the Navy and Marine Corps, the Marine Corps reports to the Department of the Navy, they were the most strictly segregated. So the vast majority of African American sailors who worked in ship messes as cooks. So the notion of putting the notion of the Navy fielding an African American baseball team would have been an even bigger leap than the Army doing it, or the Air Force doing it. And of course, the idea of integrated teams, or the teams playing each other, would have been another leap altogether. So I guess I'm not terribly surprised about that. It took the Navy quite a bit longer than it took the Army to really integrate. And again, I can talk about why that was, but to get to a point where race mattered less. Yeah, I'm so glad Sandra found this. This Rookie of the Year Jackie Robinson comic book, and it's a visual display of what Branch Rickey was talking about, and you can see the middle panel there where there's Jackie Robinson being drafted in November '42, commissioned as an officer. That's important because it means he's taking on a much more senior leadership role, and he's doing something that very few African Americans were able to do, that is to gain an officer's commission, which is a very big deal. And then you can see here the second panel in the middle one is Jackie Robinson leaving service and getting back into sports. So again, they're not making a causal connection here, but they're certainly showing the link that if he can serve in the military and if he can be an officer in the U.S. military, that means he's got special character. He's a important person. And again, as Branch Rickey said, if he can put up with all of the segregated discrimination and prejudice that he would have put up with in the Army in 1942 to 45, he can certainly put up with whatever is going to happen to him with the Brooklyn Dodgers. And again, all credit to Branch Rickey for making that decision. And of course, all credit to Jackie Robinson for all of the things that he was able to do to help to integrate Major League Baseball. So to this day, as most of you are baseball fans will know, number 42 is retired for every major baseball team for that reason. And there's a movement in Pittsburgh to do the same with Roberto Clemente's number 21. And for parochial reasons, I hope that they do it. Yeah, getting into the All-American Girls Professional Ball Club. The idea was to put these teams in places that weren't well served, normally by the minor leagues, places where there weren't a lot of baseball teams. Yeah, again, the idea wasn't so much to try to compete. The idea really wasn't even so much to try to make a lot of money. None of these teams really made any money. They were thought of as nonprofit, but the idea was to create an alternative form of entertainment. The idea was to, again, have a place where you could take your daughters, you could take your children, you could take your wife, and not so much worry about fights breaking out or beer being thrown on you or whatever else. And of course, made very famous by the movie A League of Their Own, which has kept this in the spotlight and kept this something that people continue to talk about and people continue to be interested in.
I have a quick question. This is really interesting to me. So this was in a publication. So you can see here, it's got a page number, and there's another essay on the back. Is it common at the time, do you know, like for men's sports to have like their height, their weight, their birth dates, where they're born? Like, is that a common thing?
Yeah, it was common. What's not common is that they had a chaperone. That's not so common. But yeah, fairly common. And you still see it. You know, when a baseball player comes to the plate, they list very often his statistics, and sometimes early in the year they will list height and weight, just so you know that they do it with football players too when they introduce them. Yeah, it's not an uncommon thing to do. You see it on the back of baseball cards, things like that.
As you can tell, I don't know a lot about sports, so
But I mean, you're right. It definitely hits differently when it's when it's being done for women. And if you can go back a slide too, please. If you can, yeah, the manager is a man in this case. Again, Tom Hanks in the movie, but the chaperone, of course, is a woman. So there's still this kind of, I don't know what you'd want to call it, this kind of almost a loco parentis vision of this. And I don't know why, even if it is notable, but you've got two players here who came from Canada too, which is interesting. One from Hamilton, and I think there was one from Saskatoon or someplace like that. So yeah. Yep, and there they are wearing the skirt uniforms that tennis players still wear. And I know there's been some controversy about this. There are many female tennis players that want to get away from that and go to a different uniform that they see as being less exploitative. Something similar, of course, going on here. A male umpire, of course, calling the balls and strikes, something that's only starting to change now. I think the NFL has female referees, and Major League Baseball does not have women umpires, but they do have umpires in the minor leagues, and hopefully that will change someday soon. But yeah, kind of a fascinating thing that did not last much longer after the war was over. This is in, I think, one of the last seasons that the league was in play.
Well, I think it's interesting, like if you watch the movie A League of Their Own, like some of the pictures I've been seeing, like in our archive and in the archives around the country, mirror scenes out of that movie. And I feel like this is one of those. It just looks like something I saw in the movie.
This one looks to me like a publicity still, right? I mean, this is, I don't think this one's not from gameplay. This is, this is something done to promote the game. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, but I could imagine the producers of that movie going back and finding stills and kind of building scenes around that for some verisimilitude and whatnot. And the uniforms obviously look quite similar to what they were, though I haven't seen the movie in a long time. But yeah, it's a great picture. It's clearly staged, and whoever that took the picture, they got it pretty good. They got the dirt from the slide right at the right moment, and yeah, that's a pretty good picture.
He's a good marketing photographer, so that's good.
Yeah, right. It is.
So we have a bunch of questions. We're going to go ahead and start asking those for you. Tiffany.
So I'm going to start by saying I'm a First World War historian. So if I don't know the answer, I'm just going to tell you I don't know the answer.
Well, we hope you do. Your excitement for the topic was so great. So hopefully. Tiffany from Metro Atlanta wants to know, were there any important games that were played in Europe during the war to boost morale among the soldiers or foster diplomacy? Which is interesting because a lot of the ones we just saw are Pacific theater.
Or Asia. Yeah, no, there were some games played in Europe. England, I know for sure. I don't think there were too many in the post-war period. I'd have to check on Germany because the U.S. had this. A friend of mine from high school, actually, who's a professor at Vanderbilt, wrote this book on kind of the American State Department's effort to bring American culture into Germany at the end of World War II. But she focuses mostly on cinema, not so much on sport. So I'd have to check it out. I know there were games played between soldiers and airmen and to keep morale up. I don't know if there was anything done explicitly to the European public as a kind of demonstration. I'd have to try to look that up. I'm not aware of anything like that. There was at the end of World War One. I'm not aware of anything at the end of World War II.
Okay. Sue has a question, which I think is really interesting because you sort of hit upon it, but for people who are unfamiliar with why censorship occurred during the war, why weren't they allowed to say what the weather was when they were doing the broadcasts?
Yeah, the theory was if you somehow revealed that there were bad storms in New York, then the Germans could calculate, because of course weather moves west to east. The Germans could calculate when bad weather was going to appear over Europe, and in this time period especially, if the weather is bad, airplanes simply cannot fly. So because the Allies especially had air superiority or air supremacy, they're two different concepts, but the Germans would tend to do localized attacks on days when the weather was expected to be bad, so that it would limit the ability of Allied airplanes to dominate the skies. So the Allies had a tremendous advantage from 1942 on in that they controlled the Atlantic Ocean. So they had better weather data than did the Germans. And famously, those of you who know your World War II history, D-Day almost was canceled because of the incredibly bad weather that was in the North Atlantic. The Germans did not know there was going to be a 48-hour gap in the weather. It was that 48-hour gap that led Eisenhower to go ahead and order D-Day. The Germans, who didn't have the access to that weather data, the Germans thought, well, the weather is too bad. We can do a stand down. In fact, Rommel went to Germany to visit his wife because he thought the weather was so bad. So weather data could be really, really important.
Yeah. And you might be familiar with this. I know people outside of New York might not be, but New York Public Library has these beautiful stained glass windows, and they were actually painted black during World War II, and they only restored them in the late 90s. So it was after I started working for
Really?
the late 90s.
Wow.
Yeah,
so I wonder why they would have done that. I guess the fear of an air raid? Why would you paint the windows of the New York Public Library black? It's highly unlikely the Germans are going to air raid New York City in that time period.
They did have air raids and drills. We have some letters from Mo and Sylvia Weiner. They talked a lot about the air raids. She was in charge of helping get people to the air raid shelters in New York. So she writes a couple of times about
drills, but
air raid drills.
Yeah, but there were no German bombers. I guess there was the fear that they could do it, but they never did it. Yeah, there was a big worry among the United States that the Germans were going to build a 4-engine bomber, which not coincidentally was called the America Bomber, and that it might be able to reach the United States. But I think everybody in the know realized, those of you that fly overseas a lot know, when you fly from Europe to the United States, you're going into very powerful winds, which is why it takes 6 hours for me to fly to London, but 7.5 to fly back. And those winds in the face of propeller planes really require an enormous amount of fuel out of the planes. But yeah, I guess you do the air raid drills just in case, but yeah, not technologically feasible in 1942
they didn't have
or
any
43.
actual attacks. It was just the drills, and I think the idea that something could happen.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, it's an extreme step though to paint over. Yeah. Okay. Whatever. Yeah.
Well, they restored it, so they're gorgeous again. So that's good.
And there is this theory, that a lot of food rationing and gasoline rationing, a lot of that was just to remind the American people that there is, in fact, a war going on. So that, scrap drives and painting stained glass over or whatever was just a way to kind of remind everybody this is real. This is serious stuff. Although in other parts of America, like Mobile and New Orleans, they didn't turn the lights out in the city, so the German U-boats that were operating could clearly see all of their targets right in front of them. But yeah, I mean, some idea to keep people, reminded that there is a world war being fought.
Yep. How many, or were there any well-known players who were killed in action? And if so, would it have been publicized?
It would have been publicized, but probably after a delay. All I was able to find are there were 2 people who had been Major League Baseball players and 2 people league players who were killed in action. I did not recognize any of their names. So I don't know. I know in Ted Williams's case, Williams was insistent that nothing special be done to protect him. The fact that Warren Spahn was at the Battle of the Bulge and Yogi Berra was at Normandy would indicate that they didn't do anything to try to stay out of harm's way. But had they been killed, yeah, it would have been announced. Who's the famous the band leader who was killed? Glenn Miller. I mean, others that celebrities that were put in harm's way. So I can't imagine them making an exception for baseball players in this case.
Were there any African American women who played in the Women's Baseball League?
Not to my knowledge, unless you know differently, Sandra, but it was as segregated as everything else.
Yep. And there's a couple of people who ask questions about pictures, so I might run back, try to,
Sure.
and forgive my sloppy slide deck manipulation. But while I'm doing that, is there any reason that Ted Williams didn't participate in the Army-Navy game? Did they leave the Marines out?
Well, the Army would say it's always a good idea to leave the Marines out. I try never to do any international trip with the military unless I've got a Marine with me. I like the Marines a lot. My guess is he just wasn't in the same physical location. Williams was as dedicated to being a Marine aviator as he was to being anything else in his life. Whatever other crazy went on in that family and whatever other stuff went on with Ted Williams, and as some of you know, there was a lot of crazy in and around Ted Williams. But he took his career as a Marine aviator unbelievably seriously. And it does make you wonder how much even better his baseball statistics would have been had he not twice left the Boston Red Sox to go and serve with the Marine Corps.
I know I can't remember his name now. There is a Black baseball player who served in World War I, who basically his career was prior to the war and then after the war. And I can't remember his name for the life of me, but like his primary years playing were spent, like he lost
yeah. Yeah, this happened to a lot of folks. We also had where I teach here in Carlisle, we had the Carlisle Indian School here, the Indian Industrial School here, a really shameful moment in American history. But several baseball players, including Grover Cleveland, Mordecai Brown, a couple of others who came through here at one point. So actually a remarkable number of people that later played Major League Baseball came through here. The most famous athlete that came through here was Jim Thorpe, for whom our gymnasium is named and for whom one of our big kind of exhibit days is named.
Yeah. So it's let me get the right name here. Doug said that in this photograph, there appears to be, it says Fort Randolph on this side, and he thinks it says Champions 1933 or 35.
Yeah.
Do we know what that's about?
Yeah, I'm guessing it's a league championship. I'm guessing that the E's stand for Company E or Flight E if they're Air Force, whatever the equivalent would have been then, Squadron E or whatever. And probably like they do today, you put on the outfield wall, Major League Champions 1912 or whatever. Company E or whatever they were, Flight E, won the championship, and they're going to let everybody know that they won it.
Okay, and then we have someone said, and then if you guys can see this a little better than I can, there is someone here, a picture that says Homestead Graves, number 28 on the Army.
Oh yeah. Oh, so maybe there was.
Yeah, so he put
maybe
out
there was an exception made.
Yeah.
I'm just looking over the other. None of the other. I don't know if the Norfolk Stars were once a Negro League team.
I'm not sure.
But most of the rest of those are Philadelphia, even though they may have moved cities, like the Philadelphia Athletics. Washington Senators are now the Minnesota Twins. It's a different Washington Senators now. That's the only evidently African-American team that I know of. So yeah, that would be interesting to go through and try to find out.
Yeah, and thank you, Kevin, for pointing that out to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for catching that.
All right, so I think we have time for one more question.
Let me write that. I'll have to Google that guy later. Yeah.
I will point out that it is on the Army side, and you had said that it was much more difficult for the Navy to integrate.
Yeah, just the racial stuff was a little different on the Navy side. Racial stuff, that sounded terrible. The patterns of segregation were different on the Navy side than they were on the Army side. The Army was segregated too, but later in the war, around the time of the Battle of the Bulge, the Army started to loosen up some of its rules because they just needed manpower. The Navy did not do that.
Right, and then last question, because we're almost out of time. Bill asked about Jackie Robinson, and he said, when did Jackie Robinson serve overseas, and when was he beloved? So, did people know who he was during World War II? I know he had some other accomplishments before he went into the military, right?
Yeah, he was a very well-known athlete. I don't think he was a terribly famous person during World War II. Um, I think it's his playing with the Dodgers that kind of vaults him into national. He wins Rookie of the Year award, if I'm not mistaken.
Mhm.
That makes him a national name really, really fast. But no, I don't think he was particularly well known from 1942 to 1945.
Okay. I'm gonna stop on our last picture of the girls' professional baseball league, and I want to ask you, do you have any like parting thoughts you want to leave the audience with tonight?
I just think it's really interesting to think about the ways in which, especially for us teachers, the ways in which all of these kind of threads of American life weave together: military service, baseball, racial discrimination, gender discrimination, all of these things, and the way that they kind of come together. And again, I'm not trying to look at this with overly rosy eyes, but again, I don't think it's any coincidence that it's after World War II, immediately after World War II, when two of the most important American institutions, baseball and the military, desegregate. And there is at least a correlation, if not a direct causation, between those two things. And of course, it is Jackie Robinson who provides the arc between them. And that's not a coincidence. There's a reason why these two institutions did what they did. And I think it's also this thing that we historians tend to believe, that everything is connected to everything else. So you don't want to look at one element just in isolation. You want to look at the ways that all of these threads are coming together for good and for ill.
All right, fantastic. And then with that, we are going to say thank you guys for joining us tonight. We're going to be back in October 3rd at 7 p.m. again. We're going to discuss the Salem witchcraft trials with Karen Wolf from John Carter Brown Library. So this is going to be fantastic. We have a first edition printing of Cotton Mather's book. So that's a pretty interesting
Oh,
book.
great.
And then book breaks this weekend, September 8th, with John Grinspan. He's going to be discussing Wide Awake, the forgotten force that elected Lincoln and spurred the Civil War. Wide Awakes are really an interesting group, so you guys should totally join that program on Sunday at 2.